Okay, so welcome to this amazing panel. I'm not Australian, so I don't really know anyone on this panel, which is brilliant. So it says on my notes to introduce people. I'm not going to do that. I don't know you. I don't want to read platitudes about you that I don't know for true. So as part of this process, when we get to the first questions, what would be awesome is if you could just really briefly introduce yourselves. I'm sure this room knows you all. They don't know me. But that would be brilliant just to help me understand where you're coming from so I can get the questions right later. So this panel is on the possibilities of tomorrow, heat, light, and power in 2050. So it's something close to my heart. It's about future gazing. It's about crystal ball gazing. It's about plausible but extreme scenarios. The most useful things you can possibly have when you have literally no idea what's going to happen in the future. So we've got a rich history in the UK. People probably know National Grid in the UK, the system operator, transmission owner. They've been producing wonderful future energy scenarios for well over a decade now. And they're amazing because they sort of try and they call them scenarios, but they're really predictions. They're quite safe and they're wrong every year, but not wrong in the long run, wrong the next year. You know, on solar, on electric vehicles, on everything. So they are the opposite of the scenarios we're talking about today. They're not useful. They're just wrong. So let me tell you an experience I had with scenarios that were much more useful. And it tallies with the process you've been through here. I had the unique opportunity with some others to lock some students away for a weekend in the University of Lancaster, so the northwest of England. And the reason why we asked these students to go with us on this mission was because we were bored of terrible scenarios in the UK. And the reason why we were bored of them was because when the industry gets together, they all start to agree on things. And the scenarios come out are very safe. They're not very extreme. They're definitely plausible because that's exactly what's going to happen tomorrow-ish. So we asked a bunch of non-cynical, non-energy students. We provided them with some tools, some experience, but we let them go nuts. And what they came up with was completely mad, plausible extremes. And they weren't that dissimilar to the scenarios that we're going to learn about today, and then we're going to discuss. You know, we had a scenario called Water World, where global warming had meant ocean rise happened a lot quicker. All parts of the country were now islands, and cities were energy sufficient, and everything was run through a tribal elder. We had a blockchain world. We had a robot world. We had all sorts of things. So there's something really refreshing when you see scenarios that are just, at first glance, a bit mad, but then you realize in the second glance they're actually quite useful because they start to ask questions. They start to challenge conventional wisdoms, and they make you address questions like, what am I doing in this completely different world? And that's why they're really useful. So we're going to be basing these on the 4 scenarios put together by Matt Finch and Energy Consumers Australia, and I think we've got a video to introduce them. So can we play the video?
Join Energy Consumers Australia and stakeholders from across the Australian energy sector to explore futures of heat, light and power at the 2020 Foresighting Forum. I'm Matt Finch of mechanicaldolphin.com, and I'll be guiding you through 4 scenarios for the future of heat, light and power in the Australia of 2050. Bundle, patchwork, plenty and rescue. In Bundle, we'll be asking what happens if consumers' energy needs are combined with employment or other services. In Patchwork, we'll explore a world in which the national energy grid has fragmented, requiring local intervention to meet users' needs. In Plenty, we'll look at what happens if catastrophic climate change actually frees Australia to generate abundant renewable energy. And in Rescue, we'll explore what might happen if a new social and political movement drives the transition to cheap renewable energy while compensating incumbents. We'll be investigating these scenarios, their implications, and the options they generate in a series of videos and documents, plus a live panel discussion at the forum. Please join us in February 2020 to explore the challenges and opportunities in these futures of heat, light, and power.
Wonderful. And I can assure you that Matt Finch talks faster than that in real life. So when he was talking through these scenarios, yeah, he's a very engaging. I don't know how many people have been involved in creating these scenarios. Hands? Wonderful. So you'll be a little bit familiar. So these are 4 scenarios. We've got one on bundle, which we've heard about already from Ben, actually. Some of this idea of what happens if consumers' heat, light, and power get bundled together with employment and other services. We've got one called patchwork, which is could declining trust see the national energy grid fragment, requiring local action to get a much more fragmented bottom-up system? Plenty. What happens if catastrophic climate change freezes to generate abundant wind and solar power so Australia becomes a global powerhouse and sends power through very long cables to other places? And rescue. So what happens if a new movement drives the transition to cheap renewable energy while compensating the incumbents? And David, I might come to you later on that bit of news that came out as well that sounded a lot like rescue that you sent to me, but I haven't had a chance to read properly, so I might get you to explain it later. So with those scenarios in mind, which are hopefully useful, I'd like to work along the panel for the first time with a question. But before I do, what I really have enjoyed at this conference is the questions coming through on Slido and the dynamics of which one gets to the top. Because that's more interesting to me somehow than the questions themselves sometimes, just watching that process about which one is catching the mood of the room. So please go nuts on Slido, both in terms of questions and in terms of getting them voted up or down the agenda. Okay, so I'm going to work along the panel one at a time, starting with Kerry, if that's okay. So the question I'd like you to start with is, in the context of the broad view that these scenarios present us with, looking at them, what are we talking about enough already? You know, that these scenarios are we're okay with them. What are we not talking about enough? So what big questions are they starting to raise that we're really going to need to talk about soon? If we start to go down any of these pathways, and if you could just briefly introduce yourself at the start of that as well, that would be magnificent.
Thank you. As many people in the room know, I'm the chair of the Energy Security Board, and we were set up to basically implement the recommendations from the Finkel review, excepting the one that wasn't approved by COAG, and I won't mention it. The other thing that we do is work with the market bodies and try and get more cooperation and sort of coordination across them. And the other thing we do is what COAG Energy Council decides that they want to have a look at any particular time. And the Energy Council are basically all of the state energy ministers that form the market. So at the moment we're quite busy. Just in terms of the scenarios, I think the things that it raises, the bundle issue, I think, raises the issue of inequality between consumers, and everyone in here would be very aware of the fact that lower income households get hit with affordability issues much more than others. Not simply because their bills go up, but simply because they really don't, they're often renters, don't have solar panels, don't have access to other devices and energy saving things that would actually allow their bills to go down if they could. And I think so I do think we need to put more attention on that. And the other issue that I'd mention is in the rescue scenario. I think one of the things we really need to put more focus on, which was just discussed a bit in the last session is the industry adjustment as we move out of coal. And Australia has a particular issue with coal, which is not particularly electricity related, but rather it is a major export industry, and we do have ports exporting coal that are amongst the largest ports in the world for coal exports. And adjusting from that industry to something else is going to be a challenge. But I'd remind everybody who's in my age group that we have been through industry adjustment on a major scale before, and it was managed quite well. And that was when the Hawke government decided to basically drop tariffs to next to nothing. And you may not recall, but we used to have a manufacturing industry once and we don't anymore. And the reason for that was largely the tariff reduction. And we now have a largely service economy with a few other bits of manufacturing here and there. But we could do with going back to have a look at what was done about industry adjustment at that time, because we do need to dust those books off again and just have a look at what happened.
Brilliant, thank you. So next up we've got Alex from the Australian Energy Market Operator. Is that right? Good, okay, that's a good start for me. So maybe you could just introduce yourself briefly and then have a crack at the same question. What are we doing enough of? What aren't we doing enough of?
Thanks, Jeffrey, and a wonderful good morning to everyone. As you have highlighted, yes, I do work for the Energy Market Operator, so that's the equivalent of National Grid, and I'm probably one of these people who get those scenarios completely wrong, because one of my unenviable jobs is actually to do the equivalent of the National Grid scenarios in Australia, which is a part of the Integrated System Plan, which is also one of the recommendations that came out of the Finkel review. And for my sins, I'm also one of the people who are supposed to connect new renewables to the grid, which is a rather challenging process, so we can talk about this as well. I think I was quite lucky in my career that I had a quite varied background from academia, working a long time for the National Research Agency, CSIRO, actually doing lots of scenario work there, and actually think that there are sometimes some scenarios that actually get it right. And then also in industry, actually watching the real life implementation of what it takes to get these things implemented. So to your question, what are we doing enough of in these? I mean, firstly, I want to congratulate ECA and everyone who has contributed to this, because these scenarios really stretch the thinking. And frankly, that is also something that we need, for example, when we do the Integrated System Plan, because that's very constrained by sort of the physical and economic reality. But I think it helps us, for example, to really stress test, is the physical backbone that we are considering, is that actually consistent with some of those worlds? And you know, you should challenge us and we will challenge ourselves to do that. So that's really helpful. In terms of what can we do more with these scenarios, I mean, ultimately, it's important to step back and say, why are we actually doing all of these scenarios exercises? It's a really important question. And I think, for me, the answer is it's to enable us to make better decisions going forward. That's ultimately what we're trying to do here. And I think there can be sort of two ways we can maybe use these scenarios going forward. One is really to think about, as we go to bundle, patchwork, plenty, or rescue, what are actually the decisions along the way that individuals and societies will have to make to get us to this outcome, and do we like this outcome or don't we like this outcome, and therefore how do we actually want to steer the nation and shape the national dialogue around our future, which I think is something in some sense that's missing, having a really informed dialogue about the future. I think the second way we might want to try to use them is actually, let's look at some of the real-term decisions that we have to make as a nation right now and as consumers right now. I mean, take one example, and Kerry mentioned it, sort of our very strange relationship to coal, with the Liddell power station going to retire sort of 23 to 24. How do these scenarios actually help us to make some of the decisions of how we should respond to that? because there's actually a number of quite different things we can do. We can just say, sit back, relax, the market's all going to solve it. Or we can say, well, actually, a lot of these scenarios are very strong on DER. So, well, let's really take this as an opportunity to really push DER in a very intelligent way to maximize the opportunity of this new technology. Or we say, well, let's build some more interconnection to tap into the maybe unused resources that we have in other parts of the country. Or let's induce new generation and circumvent the market and make the market maybe not work as efficiently. At the moment, by the way, we're doing sort of a combination of all four, which is probably not a good decision or no decision at all. But I hope that by having the endpoint in mind, it actually helps us to really make better decisions in the near term. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So next up, we have Lachlan. From which university? From Australian National University. So please tell us a little bit about what you do and then have a crack at that question as well.
Great. Thank you and good morning all. It's a real pleasure to be here. So my name's Lachlan Blackwell. I head up the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program, which has potentially the worst acronym ever. We're a largely government-funded R&D program, and we have a number of projects running nationally, and we're quite lucky to work with many of the organisations represented in the room. So typically we work on, the integration of DER into the grid, but really with a view to how we operate future electricity grids that have both high penetration renewables and a high penetration of distributed energy assets. So I thought this panel session was really, really interesting because I think, often when we are working at the coalface, we're sort of focused on what we're going to do today and what we're going to do tomorrow to get the system to move forward. But actually being able to kind of break that thinking and step ahead to 2050 really gives us some latitude to actually think outside the square we often get trapped in. From my perspective, the thing that is covered off well in the scenarios and that we cover off very well in discussions like this is the technology. And it feels almost silly as an engineer to be sort of saying, well, let's actually not talk about more technology because it's a very comfortable spot for engineers and I think for many of us in the industry. So I think, we have a portfolio of technologies that are likely to get us to any future. The challenge we obviously have and the challenge that would be highlighted by the four scenarios is really how we bring those technologies together and integrate all of them to make the system work. So I think that conversation's well underway and the scenarios certainly highlight that the technology aspect. So from my perspective, the thing that we're not talking about is how we actually develop a shared vision of the future system. And scenarios are a start to that, and it's a really good start. I'd reflect that a couple of months ago, many of us in this room were in the same room at the Future Electricity Markets Summit, where we were talking about, future markets and, future integration challenges. And I'd reflect that many of those conversations ended with the fact that everyone was saying, oh, actually the national electricity objective is not fit for purpose anymore. We just need to fix that, and then everything else will kind of follow from that. At a conversation later in the year, I then heard somebody say, actually, it's not the national electricity objective, it's just the Constitution, because that's what's created the federated system in Australia, and actually if we just fix that, it'll follow through. So my take on that is not necessarily that the Constitution itself is broken or that the electricity objective is broken per se. It's that we actually haven't yet had the opportunity to have a conversation about the shared vision that we have for the future. And that's obviously an important conversation that we need to involve ourselves in, but also consumers more broadly, because often they kind of get left out of the conversation until we've all agreed on what we're going to do and we're sort of ploughing merrily ahead. The other thing I'd sort of reflect on with these scenarios is actually that I think it's unlikely we get any one of these individual scenarios, but I think it's very highly likely that we end up with a mix of all of them. And so one of the really interesting things is to think about how you actually manage a future that has quite distinct scenarios for different people. And we already start to see that today when you think about distributed energy resources. We already have sort of, the haves and the have-nots. And when you move to these four scenarios, which could happily coexist, or maybe not happily, but could absolutely coexist, we need to think about not only how we set the system up to actually work in any of those contexts, but actually how we set the system up to be able to allow all of those future scenarios to coexist, because different scenarios will obviously benefit people differently. And so ultimately, I think ensuring that we have a view to energy equity, and that irrespective of the which scenario individual consumers, both residential and industrial, find themselves, we need that vision for how everybody can benefit from this future system.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think the Constitution is now firmly on the agenda for this panel. So I just wanted to make sure we've registered that. Not that you have to tackle the Constitution, Alison, but maybe you could introduce yourself and then have a crack at the question of enough and not enough.
Great. Alison Rowe from the Australian Energy Foundation. We've been around 20 years. We work with all levels of government community. Our vision is an equitable zero-carbon society, and we really work to empower people to take action. I actually see these 4 scenarios already starting to play out. I was in Tasmania last week, and it was quite interesting to see that Catch, that sort of advertising sales bulk buy thing that pops up on everyone's Facebook or Insta, is starting to sell energy. So we've got a shopping, online retailer selling energy. Patchwork is already happening. We're seeing the uprising of community energy, local councils considering whether they'll go back to be a retailer and own assets. Plenty. I would say that we're the poster child for climate change this summer, and it's not something to be proud of. And rescue is really, I think, where we're going to move. We've seen the movement of activism, and we've seen an increase in the community voice. But surprisingly, and hopefully pleasantly for you, Jeff, I wanted to talk about the economics, because there is actually nothing in any of these scenarios that refers to the economy. So I agree that we need vision and leadership, and we keep talking about that might be zero emissions by 2050. But that's too late. And when we keep talking about a target that far out, we don't have any action plans or any short-term metrics to know that we're on the way. There was a really interesting article I tweeted last night, which was written by Tom Compass, who is an environmental economist at ANU and University of Melbourne. He said it costs the ratio for inaction on climate change versus accelerating to net emissions is 20 to 1. It will cost this economy 20 times more to respond to climate change than it will to actually get to zero net emissions. So for me, I'm really concerned about that. I looked at the Outlook report, the Australian National Outlook report that was done by CSIRO, which did have some scenarios for us. And it was quite interesting to look at, they sort of had 2 scenarios, business as usual or become a world leader. Business as usual had the assumption that we resolve the politics around energy policy. But still in 2060, we were 480 megatons of carbon. We had a 60% increase in energy use, and households were spending about 38% less as a percentage of income on energy. Being a world leader meant that we actually played and operated in the global market. We achieved net emissions by 2050, and households spent 68% less on their energy as an income, and we achieved about a 6 to 28% increase in consumption. So if I sort of look at those scenarios and what that means, there's no sort of story about economy in any of those scenarios. And if we don't include that, these will be pipe dreams, but I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. We've got so much stuff building up for the next question as well. So it's, last but not least, Cameron, who, for those who were here yesterday, ended the day, or ended the kind of like formal session before we all had a beer, with some design thinking and kind of like transitions and design thinking work. So I'm dying to hear from you on this one as well, but also please do introduce yourself for those who weren't here yesterday.
Thanks. So I'm Cameron Tonkinwise. I did speak right through questions conveniently yesterday, which is a very good way to never be challenged. So I should try and talk a little less now. So one of the things I wanted to start with is that I run the Design Innovation Research Centre, and indicated yesterday that a lot of the work that we've done is in the criminal justice sector, bringing kind of design thinking, design-driven innovation to social change across that sort of sector. We've been doing that for 10 years. And one of the huge challenges working in that space is fear. We live in a media ecology which absolutely thrives on driving up fear around crime. It's now become a geopolitical mechanism in terms of terrorism. One of the first things that we learn as practitioners when you're trying to get people to future is that you need to get them to park fear. So it's a major thing swimming around when one tries to do scenarios. It's very difficult to do. Scenario work just so quickly swerves into Black Mirror. It's very difficult to try and convince people that that fear is not permanent, that there will forever be bad actors who will take any kind of proposition you make and immediately work out how to game it, and those are just the CEOs. So it's a very difficult thing to do, and we have a kind of version of that scenario which is patchwork. But one of the things that I draw attention to about in that scenario is that it recognises that it's not a general distrust. That in fact it's the complete reverse. It's a scenario based upon the presence of trust and localised trust. So I think this is one of the mechanisms to get out of a kind of fear version of thinking about the future, that whilst there might be a certain type of fear that is pushing people towards a walled garden approach to microgrids, on the other hand, what you're seeing is a recognition that you can't do this alone. And we do have that as a dominant imaginary at the moment. So the idea that I'm going to put PV on my roof and get a Tesla battery because I can afford to is my way of giving the bird to the rest of the world as it goes under. So I'm going to be good, I don't care about you. And so we kind of have this defiant version. The complete reverse is a completely connected, you should be thoroughly connected and just price signalled changing behaviour. The middle ground is something like, I trust my local communities, as we just heard in the session before. I want to think about the provenance of my power, and I'm prepared to kind of contribute to the sustaining of that local power. So I think it's a really interesting version. I do a lot of work on platform cooperatives, which is an attempt to kind of resuscitate cooperatives who are very important in the rollout of electrification in the first place. To resuscitate cooperatives as a way of taking back the sharing economy from exploitative digital platforms. And also then giving the power of digital platforms to cooperatives. So I think these are really important alternative economies. They're not corporate futures. And I think they're important to kind of put in the mix there. So that was the first thing, just around fear and cooperation. The second thing is that when you do futures work, it's always very difficult not to try and put in place everything. So the one thing I just wanted to add to these kind of scenarios that we've got is to start to think about other futuring occurring in other places, and again, not the technology ones, but the kind of social ones, the kind of things we were hearing about from George last night over drinks, very changing nature of the kind of demographic profile of Australia. We just did some work with our colleagues at Western Sydney University on a project called Cooling the Commons. The project was about thinking about shared approaches to cooling practices, rather than cooling being the retreat to privatised spaces of air conditioning. Though one of the scenarios was, of course, using cooling spaces, going to privately owned public spaces like malls. Hopefully you'd go to a library instead of a mall. I used to live in Pittsburgh, and on snow days or on heat days, Carnegie Mellon would throw open its doors and act as a kind of refuge for anyone in the community. So the ways in which you start to see society shifting to, for example, an increased number of days over 40 degrees, an increased number of nights are going to be over 30 degrees, particularly in a place like Western Sydney where you're getting a lot of development, Melbourne similarly. Then you need to start thinking about whole changes in the nature of what it means to be an institution. Your shared value as a corporation is now the way in which you offer cooling or heating services, not just the bundle version, but actually just as an act of community spirit. Another part of that scenario, of course, was cooling practices associated with nighttime activities, shifting practices from daytime to nighttime, and the recognition that we need to start to be a Southeast Asian country. And we have night markets, and you do a lot of that kind of work as you try and wait for the nights to cool off. And that's absolutely demographically probable, just even based on the kind of populations we have. So trying to get these cultural transitions, the recognition that these populations that George talked about last night, are preferring out of habit or out of necessity to live in dense environments. So again, the suburban mentality needs to be factored out. You need to start thinking about energy production and consumption in apartments, in dense urban environments. And then you need to start thinking about how they handle hot days, trying to increase the capacity to move breezes through, increasing external activities at the night, shared consumption. These all become different kind of ways of thinking about these scenarios. So I think it's very important to kind of keep imagining these cultural components. I'll give one last kind of complexifier and the way scenario work needs to always think about multiple inputs. So one of the other big ways of thinking about Sydney in relation to heat days is, for example, just increasing green canopy. We know there's a lot of people doing work. I've got colleagues at both UNSW and Western Sydney doing this work at the moment. The Committee for Sydney or the Greater Sydney Commission or whichever one has also been promoting a lot of this kind of work around green canopy. We had a small think piece in the conversation in which we said green canopy is fantastic. We need a lot more shading. It does have crime prevention aspects in terms of who you can see behind the tree, so suddenly the fear factor's back. But the other issue is that it takes 30 to 40 years to get to a shade tree. And that's 30 to 40 years of less rainfall or high wind events, such as we keep having. And then they also take out the grid at the same time, as we know. So now we're in this very complicated situation that the solution of shared cooling, which would reduce demand on air conditioning, which would actually get us to a very different type of city that might look desirable because we're looking more cosmopolitan and fitting our profiles. All of that becomes very difficult without a really extensive landscape management strategy. And I don't know who's educating those landscape managers right now. It seems to me that would be a really important portfolio for a ministry in the New South Wales government.
Thank you. Well, that was a cracking first round. So let me just try and get my head around some of the things that came out of that, because they all feed into where we're going to go next. So we've heard a little bit about what economy are we going to be in the future, and what's the role of markets versus steered strategy. We've heard that these are good ways of stress testing, that are decisions, it helps you understand the decisions you're going to need to take along the way, but we're lacking a shared vision of where we're going. And also, to some extent, there might be a constitutional crisis in there, so I think that's well and truly on the table here, or on the lack of table here. But I think there was a really important point in there about kind of like, what do these scenarios mean for different groups of people? You know, different individuals, communities, all of that kind of thing. We've also had thinking about what do we want to be in the future? Well, actually, what I heard, Alison, was that if we're not a world leader, we're in deep trouble, putting it from that scenario's point of view. So how are we going to be a world leader here? Since I'm now going to be Australian, apparently. We've also heard about the fear economy, but we've then turned that into what I think is a much more interesting message about the role of communities. So kind of like, what does that mean? Kind of like, how is the community, I mean, the community is so central to some of those scenarios in there. So what does that mean? What is the role of institutions in there? What's the changing role of institutions? And are we thinking about the design of the future for a warmer, different world, economy, all of that? So lots and lots of things going in there. So we're going to take one more question from me. And whilst we're doing this round of questions, what I'd love to see on this screen in front of us is the Slido questions and how they're materialised. And so if you're not awake and you're not doing Slido, then for goodness sake, get on with it. But what I heard about a lot in there is decisions, investment, things that we need to do now in response to potential plausible but extreme futures. So I want to take, in the same order this time, if that's okay, how do we bring more of this future thinking into current policy, investment, or any of the decisions you want to talk about? So Lachlan, the Constitution is well on, if you want to crack it in this session, but also we can have that through the Slido as well, so it's not all on you. Kerry, if you're happy to start off on that.
Yes, I might just say one thing about the Constitution since we're on it. I actually think our Constitution saves us in this space because it gives the states, and this often happens with policy matters that are very difficult at a Commonwealth level. The states just go, oh, well, if you can't sort it out, we'll go it alone. So what we have got in our states are targets for emissions reduction and renewables being set, and policies being put in place which have to a very large extent fill the gap that is currently there because of the Commonwealth Government's difficulty in this area. So I think the Constitution's not bad on that front. Looking forward, I think a lot of the issues that were raised are things where you can see things starting to happen. So you can see the grid fragmenting, particularly where it's needing to be rebuilt and the distribution networks rebuilt after the fires. You'll see more standalone power ventures going in. It's being driven largely by economics at the moment rather than by community desires, and the community needs reassurance that the service they get will be better, if not at least the same as what they used to get. But there is a lot of that development going on. And I think I might just leave it at that. But I think a lot of the issues actually that were raised are the sort of seeds of it happening, and yeah.
Brilliant. Alex?
So firstly, really important to actually bring the future into our thinking. Sort of my two pieces of advice are maybe sounding quite counterintuitive. One is look back to look forward and just open your eyes and be open to new ideas. Here are two stories to illustrate this. Firstly, around looking back to actually learn about how the future can change. Let's actually look back at some of the revolutions that happened, for example, in the energy sector. I don't know if you remember, in the mid-2000s, the whole world of gas changed. Everyone was super surprised. Shale gas and shale oil revolutionized the industry. That's actually a really interesting revolution in upper to look at, because do you know when the first shale gas well was drilled? 1824. And do you know when George Mitchell, who was sort of one of the initiators of this industry, started his work on horizontal drilling in hydraulic fracturing, whether you like it or not, but let's just leave it at that. It was in the 1980s. And then 30 years later, boom, we were surprised and there was a revolution. So what has actually happened? I think we didn't pay attention, and we sort of argued away things and trends that were very clearly visible for decades, if not centuries. And you might think, well, surely we can't be that naive, but I've actually a personal story. When I started at CSIRO, we did a report about 10 years ago, which was called Unlocking Australia's Energy Future, and it talked about, the rise of solar and wind and DER and how it's going to change the world. And we had a discussion with the department. They looked at it and they said, no, that sounds ridiculous. I mean, that can't happen. And they commissioned another report that had a different outcome. So I think the lesson for me there is, if we keep our eyes open and really have discussions like this, we can actually spot those trends, and then we need to make sure that we have an open enough mind to actually say, okay, well, let's just park all my prejudices here and think, what if that was actually true? What would actually be the consequence, and how do I prepare for that? So that's my two pieces of advice. And the last piece of advice, personal favorite of mine, is read more science fiction stories, because it is amazing when you think back what people 20, 30, 40 years ago have predicted about the world today, and when you read modern things, and I suspect there's actually a lot of ideas in there that will be part of our future.
Wonderful. And yes, I certainly commend that last point. If I could get away with reading it at work, that would be perfect.
Well, we need to exchange some sort of recommendations of what to read.
Perfect. Lachlan.
Thanks. I'm not going to touch the Constitution, and I regret raising it in the earlier point. I'm going to echo actually a similar point to what Alex made, and Kerry actually touched on it earlier as well, and that's actually to look back into history to actually understand perhaps what we're not recognising now. So I think it's very informative to go back to when we actually introduced electricity into Australia, and that was when we were transitioning from gas lighting to electric lighting. And so this is in the 1860s and the 1870s. So what really played out at that time was the incumbent gas provider was quite upset that they were about to be displaced by electric lighting. And so they started mounting a pretty significant campaign against this. They were joined in their campaign by a common media partner who was a shareholder of the incumbent gas provider. And so the media company then started a really similar campaign in a large broadsheet newspaper. At the time, there was this really significant concern about how we were disenfranchising gaslighters because they were about to be displaced by the electric switch. So if that sounds eerily familiar to what we're seeing today, it's because it absolutely is. And I think looking back, I'm not sure we handled it particularly well in the 1860s and 1870s, but the fact is we're not handling it particularly well now. I think the other thing we can look to history for is actually to see different models of of energy and the different business models that have emerged to actually take societies through energy transitions. So in the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, actually the largest proportion of cars in the world was actually electric. So particularly in the US. And there was a really significant playbook of how those electric cars were being rolled out. People were building dedicated charging stations. There were swap-out batteries. They were lead-acid batteries at the time. So 100 years before we've started to see a really significant rollout of electric vehicles, this time there was already that playbook being set up. And if you look to the business models of current large car companies that have gone electric, they're actually really just repeating the playbook from back in the 1900s. And that's really fascinating to think about what else has been tried that we've forgotten about in the last 100 years. In the 1930s, there was a book put out around, it was called the Women's Electrical Handbook, and it was intended to support women getting more involved in the electricity system. One of the appendices to that book actually has a section on tariffs. And in that section, there's about 24 tariffs that were tried at that time, and some really interesting ones. So all of our favourites, TOU was there, demand tariffs were there. They had an energy source tariff, so you could pay a different tariff depending on what type of generation unit was providing your electricity. So absolutely fascinating to think about all of these things that have been tried, not just in Australia, but elsewhere around the world. So now when we're searching for answers for the future, I think that's a good source of evidence that we can start with. The second point I'd make is simply that we actually have the ability to go and talk to customers, both residential customers and commercial and industrial customers. And again, I think that's something that we don't leverage as much as we should. There's been a really interesting growth in the inclusion of social science research in a lot of funded projects that are being funded by governments, but also particularly by ARENA. And I think ARENA's recognition in particular that social science is going to underpin and inform our transition has been really vital. And when you start to talk to consumers, you see all of these discussions around community energy models and what communities will do to support one another really coming out loud and clear. And so for all the social scientists in the room and for all the consumer advocates, I think you're doing a fantastic job. And for the rest of the industry, I think we can do a lot more to support those conversations, because a lot of our uncertainty about the future could be resolved just by going and talking to the people who are going to have to live it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we're definitely getting a trend on learning from the past. These things are cyclical in some ways. Alison.
Yeah, I think the lack of a vision and a long-term goal and short-term goal for the country, I've been thinking, how do we culturally start to think about investment decisions and policy? And perhaps it is about looking at risk. So I can't decouple climate change from the energy transition. I think they're completely linked. But if we think about, we're quite conservative as a nation when it comes to risk. I did spend 10 years working in a Japanese company. I can tell you they're more conservative. But certainly we're quite conservative. So if I think about what we need to maybe look at in terms of that economic costing of risk is start to baseline the impact to health. So health is one area that we need to actually understand the risk, and I think we've seen a significant impact to that over this summer. I can remember I was in Canberra the second week of January, and the message to the community was to not open your doors and get a breeze in. It was to shut every door, draft-proof it, and not go outside. And this was during school holidays with about 40-degree temperatures. And I asked the question about, well, how come you're still selling open flue gas heaters at Bunnings? And what's the strategy around gas in your home and draft-proofing and where are we going with that type of message? So I think there's something around health and risk, and to see the community wearing masks and still wearing masks is a massive health risk to our nation. I'm an ex-military person as well, so I think it's also our biggest security risk. And if you ask the Defence Force, I'm sure they'd agree that climate change and the impact of energy and networks is massive. It's our biggest mortality risk as a human race. It's the economic risk, and I've already said about how the numbers stack up. And it's our most ecological risk in terms of biodiversity. There's been a lot of discussion about, do we take a war room approach to trying to tackle these issues? And as an ex-military person, it's quite good. We're quite good at doing scenarios. So, military are really good at scenario planning and re-strategising. I guess the difference in this situation is the enemy is us, right? So we're actually doing this to ourselves. So how could we even think about the possible scenarios when we accept the science that we're actually causing this problem ourselves? So I do think there is a role for business. I was really pleased to see the business community and step up and commit to a 2050 net emissions target. But what they were calling for was to have the short-term industry plans, and I think it's up to business to set those, not to wait for somebody else. So there is a role of business in really transitioning and coming up with a whole integrated set of industry plans that need to get us there. And once you apply risk and strategy and scenario planning, I think we can change the investment landscape.
Brilliant. Thank you. Cameron.
So I'll just talk briefly from the educational perspective, also because you're at a university and that's primarily where I work. So when you talk about investment, I think about investing in people and skills for this kind of transition. And whether we're talking about a transition that's on the scale from gas lighting to electrical lighting, which was a very significant, large geographic area scale and obviously industry displacement, or whether we're talking about a change which is actually the complete redirection of absolutely everything in our civilization, bigger than an industrial revolution, which is not actually unlikely given the scales of the problems we're facing in relation to climate change. We need to be wholly reskilling entire disciplines for this kind of challenge. And so one of the obstacles that we currently have is the mindsets which people were educated into who are now in middle and leadership positions in the current organisations. So at the very least, we need to completely be changing the nature of anybody doing an MBA. If you're doing an MBA and you're thinking about markets and you're not thinking about changing expectations as a result of radical transitions, you have been miseducated. And you are a problem, like you're a negative asset. So we need to completely change that. We need to completely change the nature of engineering education. We know that there is a massive deficit in engineering education in relation to social practices, the anthropology and the sociology side. We know that ANU right now is in an amazing leadership position as they try to completely restructure engineering education. So we have a fantastic precedent starting there at the moment, just begun. But we actually need to completely retrofit this. Now, we need to do a complete change. I've been involved in discussions here at the university about what it means for the fact that our Vice-Chancellor has declared a climate emergency. And we're trying to get on the table that it's not just about new things that we do, adding them, it's also about things we stop doing, and that's a difficult conversation. Which are the disciplines you no longer get to teach because they actually have nothing to do to help us to make this massive kind of transition? So we're having these kinds of discussions at the moment. As a university, it's very important that we look to be in a position of leadership around educating for where the puck will be in the future. Sorry, ice skating analogy because I used to live in Pittsburgh. All right, so we need to be educating for that. On the other hand, the same kinds of problems that have been complained about in this room to do with the current federal government are playing out not only in the energy sector but in the education sector. So we have at the moment a change in the nature of the policy of the way higher education is being regulated. Funding is now going to be tied to employment success. That will further instrumentalise the education to play for now and not for the future. And we've even heard Dan Tehan say things like, one of the really annoying things about students these days is that they are refusing to take up good jobs in the mining sector. So we know that when they start regulating universities and about employment, it's to drive graduates into the mining sector. So we are literally getting the reverse signals from the government, from the very one that we should be doing in order to invest in educating for massive transition that our society now needs.
Wonderful. So we have got all sorts of lines of inquiry open here. I'm going to start to get to some of the questions from you. And probably what I'd like to do, David, if you're up for it, would you be up for describing the rescue scenario that is playing out in the media today? I can give you this microphone if you want.
It's actually the second question up there. But it's interesting because when Matt Finch was out here doing the scenario work with us in early December, he said one of the things about scenarios is that you write these really weird scenarios and then you see reality starts giving you signposts to them straight away. And the first one we actually saw was the scenario we call Plenty, because the Plenty scenario assumes we depopulate the regions as a consequence of climate action. And following the fires, there's been a lot of commentary about depopulating in the regions. So that one was starting to play out. And the second one was same issue, the fires. Mike Cannon-Brooks, who's a little bit famous here as our first ever unicorn, but also for the goading of Elon Musk to build us our big battery, has also now just built a $12 million fund to go and build microgrid infrastructure in some of the towns that have been disconnected. So it plays a little bit into the scenario we called rescue. So these scenarios, which looked really weird, you sort of see elements of them already in play just after we've started. Sorry.
So, and I think the question in there, on the actual question, is the future of the grid no grid? What I'd also like to take, just in case anyone wants to crack at it, which is a completely different question, which is why is the smart meter rollout rubbish in New South Wales? I think I'm reading that one. So why has the industry-led rollout been so slow? Should the government take action to increase digital meters? So it's have a crack. Who wants to have a crack at either of those? Brilliant. On you go.
I've actually been recently doing some reading about meters, and the take-up of meters has been very slow. But what's also very interesting is that those households that have meters don't tend to make great use of them. And the reason for that, I think, is that we don't yet have enough EVs, which will change things drastically, and nor do we have sufficient properly paid demand response mechanisms for households and business to basically be able to make money by organising their specific loads in a way that would be valuable. So these things are coming, and just on meters, the Victorians would probably tell you privately that making them mandatory was a great idea in theory, but nobody in Victoria actually liked it all that much, and it cost quite a lot of political brownie points as well as money at the time. So I think the rollout of smart meters is going to happen and get larger and larger, but it will not happen until everything else is happening.
Excellent. Alex.
Well, I might take the grid question. So, as I should, okay. You might be surprised by my answer because can we imagine a future without the grid? And I think absolutely. And I think what we'll probably see with the advent of technology is that there will be certainly some regions, in particular in Australia, that has a lot of sort of remote and fringe of grid communities where it actually is already a viable alternative today, and I think we should utilise it. Whether it is from a purely cost-effective point of view the lowest cost solution for the whole nation, I think that will really depend a lot on how technology evolution plays out, and I think there's probably a lot of reasons why the existing grid and potentially strategic additions to the network might actually create some benefit. So firstly, I mean, we actually have a network, which is a massive investment that, you know, our parents and grandparents have made. So let's actually make the most of what we already have. That is quite important, especially as we try to transition to much more renewable energy, because it allows us to tap into much greater flexibility of renewable resources, in particular wind. I mean, solar, it's, you know, as we all know, relatively easy to do in a sort of distributed residential sense, but actually for wind, you probably need to get into special locations, and you probably, the bigger the machine, the better efficiency you get. The other big challenge that we are having to tackle as we transition into a much more renewable future, which we, I think, want to transition into, is we actually need to manage this issue around dispatchability. Batteries are great, but we probably need a whole mix of different technology options, and grid can also help to unlock things like, you know, pumped hydro storage, which we don't have a lot of, but we have a few opportunities in this country. Last but not least, there is also the question, what does actually big industry do? While, you know, I think I concur with your point, it's a question of how much of a growth engine it's going to be going forward. But I think it is something that provides employment, provides wealth, provides growth, and I think we need to also help those big industries to transition, and I think grid might be one of the enablers for that. What could be some of the game changers that might make grid irrelevant? I think the big question mark is, for example, on hydrogen, because if you have very low-cost production of hydrogen made ideally from renewable resources, I think that would probably overcome the need of the grid in the future. But that's, you know, still a few years in the future. So at the moment, we need to make very careful decisions of do we, don't we, and where will we invest in the grid in the future.
Does anyone else want to come up with anything from Alison?
Yeah, I've got I guess a sort of a vision of a different grid. So I could almost see where someone will come in, just like Uber did into our market, and build a new grid. And energy will be invisible, as Ben spoke about earlier this morning. And you can almost envisage it as being free. If we have the investment and all of the market operating around the supply and demand of the grid, and it's decentralised and local assets are optimised for each area, I can see there's an alternative where there's an absolute brand new grid that just comes into the market, disrupts, and the old grid is left behind. I could also see that we have different options around energy as a service, so if maybe the transitionary before we get to free energy, because I don't think the government's planning on taxing the sun or wind yet, but if we consider that, you know, where a lot of free resources are going to provide that energy, really the market's just around the supply and the transmission of that. It's not around the resources. So why should we pay? But perhaps as a transitionary payment structure, you have energy flicks, just like Netflix, That's your energy package. Nobody is interested about what happens behind Netflix. All we want to do is press the remote, get our coffee or our wine, and sit there and watch a significant amount of television, which wastes a lot of time. We never ask the questions about what's happening behind that. We expect it to be reliable. Isn't energy quite similar? It's an essential service. So my vision is, I think that there's a really exciting market opportunity to build a whole new grid alongside this, and we should stop putting Band-Aids on a fax machine.
So can I just jump in and slightly challenge that last statement a little? So obviously my answer to why smart meter rollout has been bad is because it was atrociously designed, and I quite literally mean the physical design of the smart meters themselves. I was indicating yesterday to some colleagues from the Department of Industry that it was certainly my opinion the first time I saw one, it really looked like somebody was attaching a military bomb to the side of your house. At least your meter, your old meter, was kind of like this analog whizzing thing, and you knew it wasn't really like helpful. It wasn't going to destroy you. I mean, these things were just terrifyingly designed. But I think the reverse, which is actually part of the discussion we were having yesterday, I think the reverse of saying, well, we just have to turn everything into an app, is actually a dangerous design proposition. Yes, it's certainly, if you looked at consumers right now and asked them, they do run their lives from these devices, but we really do, I think, that's kind of my opinion, looking at this, feel like we're reaching peak app. People are not wanting to run their entire lives from the one phone. We all have notification saturation. And I also think it becomes really interesting to ask the strategic question about whether we want people to treat energy like Netflix. And I suspect that in a climate emergency, you do not want people to treat energy like Netflix. And we also know that numerous communities are also really mistrusting at the moment of just handing that over to a bot or handing it over to a corporation who will benevolently decide on what their lowest tariff is at some particular point. So I actually think there's a really strong design opportunity to say we are redesigning the home, which I kind of tried to make this argument yesterday. We are redesigning the home, and the smart meter is a great example. It's not something that needs to be a control centre. Yolanda's done fantastic work on that in relation to smart homes in general, written a fantastic book, has clearly shown the kind of errors of the metaphors that are informing a lot of smart home. So we don't need a kind of war room, and we don't want app notification saturation. So we need something else. There does need to be a space that maybe you only enter once a month to really make some decisions on this entity and how it's functioning. And one would need to reflect on whether other changes are possible. I mean, if we're going to have the possibility of changing suppliers, that's the moment in which you might do that. It's a moment in which you're having a dialogue with your company. Yesterday we talked about the customer charter. It seems to me that a smart meter is the medium through which you want to have a communication with your energy provider. It's the moment in which they're saying, you look like you're doing this. Is this what you want to keep doing? We can offer some opportunities. So now it's a communication device. It's not that you're sitting looking through a whole bunch of emails or notifications or texting somebody. I think these are all bad metaphors. I do not want to be texting Energy Australia. But I do want to have a conversation with them, and not with a chatbot, and not with somebody in another country. I would love to have a face-to-face conversation. Maybe that's just me. So I think thinking about the way we design smart meters as the redesign of the home, and as the redesign of the home as a verb, how do you home, I think this is what we need to be thinking about. And this is what we have not done with smart meters to date.
Wonderful. Lachlan.
I just thought I'd just offer some brief comments on the grid, no grid situation, because I actually think there's probably some interesting middle grounds of the grid, no grid. So I think, the first comment I'd probably make is that actually, we have the technology to effectively island on demand. Now, we don't have it widely deployed within the system, but over the next 30 years, there's a really significant potential that we will have microgrids that can connect and disconnect from the grid at will. And we're starting to see that as the solution to addressing wildfire concerns, both in the US, but also increasingly here in Australia as well. So the notion that you would have a microgrid within a community that can remain connected to the grid, maybe for most of the time, but can disconnect when necessary for resilience reasons or to avoid natural disasters, I think offers an interesting middle ground where we get to keep and use all of the existing assets that we have in the grid, but not necessarily expand them significantly. So we kind of get the best of both worlds in that situation. The other comment I'd make actually on the concept of having a new grid built out, I always tended to think that, in time we would, head towards a DC grid as well, but that would be, sort of well over the horizon, so, kind of 100-year kind of stuff. But the reality is that actually there are transformer manufacturers out there already who have transformers that have both an AC bus and a DC bus, and the power electronics in between. So actually I think it's highly likely that we may, particularly in new build suburbs, get a combination of access to AC power and combination of DC power. And that offers some really interesting opportunities because, DC microgrids in new suburbs might be a really sensible solution given that they are likely to be teamed with a lot of solar and battery storage, either residential storage or suburb scale storage. The third comment I'd make is that this concept that we might have another grid could also occur when you start to think about the role that EVs play. So, we think of EVs as batteries on wheels, but they actually have significant potential to actually transport energy separately to the transmission and distribution network. So we could see a world flipped on its head where actually you drive your car to work, you plug into a very strong part of the network in the city or in a town, you charge up your car for the day and then you drive home that energy for the evening. But if you think about the size of batteries that's in a typical EV, you would be driving home potentially 3 to 4 days worth of energy at a time. And so the concept of having this sort of secondary virtual grid, perhaps horrifying if you're running a distribution network at the moment, but potentially another interesting way where we can use combinations of approaches to have both the grid as it stands, but also no grid or a virtual grid in future.
Well, this is, I just saw something flash up at the bottom, which was, is Lachlan really saying AC/DC is the future? So I'm absolutely loving this panel, by the way, because I think we can throw bundles of questions, and we're going to tackle those in kind of like, whichever way makes most sense. So I'm going to take the next 3 questions at the top, because I think they're linked together. So there's the question about, are we looking back too much given the major disruptions, which I assume is the very current disruptions occurring? The second is, to what extent do we need to reevaluate the meaning of reliability in designing the future grid? And I think there's all sorts of like climate change, like changing energy mixes baked into that question. And then the third one, coming from the UK, where the environment movement has gone through the roof in recent times. It's always been there, but it is never more politically apparent in the UK. So this summer's tragic events may be one of the best levers to build consensus on acting on climate change. What would it take to actually capitalize on this? So I think there's a big link running through all of that, which is about future state, living with a changed climate, designing around that, reliability in the context of that. So who's brave enough to have a first crack at any of that? Alex, well done. Well,
since I was one of the proponents of looking back, let me actually clarify. I think there's a good looking back and there's a bad looking back. The bad looking back is the looking back at the energy sector saying, well, for well over 100 years, we had centralized, largely coal-fired power stations, a one-way grid, serving consumers, nice big machines, and that served us well. Why should we change it? I think that's a really bad way of looking back. But I think the good way of looking back is actually, as I think we have picked up in a number of the discussions, is actually looking back at the disruptions, looking at the change, looking at the possibilities from the past, and then to give us confidence to extrapolate into a very different future, because I'm absolutely convinced our future will be quite different to the past. So we just need to draw the right analogies. The second one is actually also an interesting one, and that's sort of exercising us in a professional capability as well as a sort of what's the future of reliability, because we have, you know, a reliability standard 0.002% of unserved energy on average not to be exceeded. I think that's a very old-fashioned way and a very rigid way of thinking about it. And I was actually in a discussion a couple of years ago that really kind of like made me step back and really think about how do we actually think about reliability. And we were in the session and we talked about reliability, and suddenly this you know, young 20-year-old person said, well, I don't care if the power goes out, you know, as long as my computer or my car is charged, you know, it's fine. And so I think what we need to do when we talk about reliability going forward, we actually need to give choice to people. And I think enabling demand response actually gives us the opportunity to give people choice. So I think for those people who really want a high reliability standard, I think we need to provide a high level of reliability. But then at the same time, we need to give people choice to basically opt out and say, actually, I don't care about this, and frankly, I don't want to pay for it. And I think that will be a much more democratic way of solving this problem. And I think we have all of the technology in place, we just need to implement it.
Alison, I was thinking maybe coming to you as well, because you were certainly starting to tell some of the narrative about the climate and about some of these changing thoughts. So anything to add?
Yeah, I might sort of go to the third question, which is about what do we need to do about building consensus on climate change. I had the pleasure of being at the Climate Emergency Summit in Melbourne last week, where there was 2,000 people there. And I think as a nation we need to declare a climate emergency. So I'll just put that out there. If we declare a climate emergency, what that actually means is we accept the science, we accept that we need a 2050 zero net society, but actually we need that much quicker. We accept that we aren't living in a safe climate right now and that we need to restore that. So I think that's one thing as a nation we need to do. Interestingly, over 10% of global population is covered by a climate emergency declaration right now, and the climate emergency first started in Australia by Darebin Council in 2016. So there's an opportunity to come together around that. There's also an opportunity to support the independent bill that's been put into Parliament by Zali, which is bipartisan, and Climate Act Now is the website that you can go to support that, to get something into politics to try and make us move. The third thing I think that we need to do as a nation is respect our First Nations people, that they looked after this land and they looked after this land very well for tens of thousands of years, and we've trashed it. And we need to go back to our First Nations people and ask for leadership and respect that and allow them to lead the way.
Wonderful. Anyone else? So, Carrie, I was wondering, there's some security questions in there. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but...
I think in terms of reliability, we really have to add resilience into the equation. It's really not in there at the moment. And with the heavy winds that we've been having, the way in which transmission towers have been falling over like matchsticks doesn't actually, the problem around that doesn't really get picked up in the way that the reliability standard is measured or the way that design is happening at the moment. So we really do have to add resilience to that equation. And I agree that we also need to look at sort of choice in the metric. Just in terms of building a consensus, look, we actually need leadership on this, to state the bleeding obvious, and the declaring a climate emergency would be one step forward, but we do have to take most of the population with us. We are, as far as I know, still in a democracy, and that really hasn't surfaced. I think recent events may make that more possible. But it really would be a step forward if we could get Commonwealth government and national leadership on this matter rather than the states having to pull their weight, which by and large they are doing or trying.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel?
I'll just make a brief one. I think in regards to the third question, I think obviously we need social leadership, we need political leadership. I think sometimes the thing that we don't talk about, which is also Australia is going through this, this extraordinary change, and in many cases we're dealing with these problems ahead of the rest of the world. And so there's actually a really sensible economic argument for us becoming world leaders in this space. We already see a lot of the leadership that's being taken through the way we operate our system, through new technologies that are being built, a new focus on things like community energy models. That's something that we can demonstrate leadership here in Australia and solve our problems, but it's also then an opportunity to actually export that know-how to the world. And it's been really interesting to see some of the more recent reports that are coming out. The WA report on microgrids that was done by Horizon Power actually focusing on the really strong economic argument. So alongside the social imperative and alongside the need for leadership, actually seeing this as a really significant opportunity for the nation, I think is also a really important way of getting people to not be afraid of this future, because if we take control of it, we can actually, we'll actually be able to be global leaders, and that's an important position for us to be in.
Wonderful. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes left. So we have got some questions down there in front of us, but what I'm wondering is whether or not it might be worthwhile a pass down the line to make sure we've got the last comments in from everyone. And I'm thinking that maybe the way to frame this is, I've asked you some questions. The audience has asked you some questions. You've engaged with them brilliantly. What else should we be talking about? What haven't we talked about? And what either keeps you awake at night in all of this, or that you just wish if you could get a decision going now that would really get us on a pathway commensurate with mitigating, taking the best advantage of, doing all of the things that would be right, just all of those things in those futures. What would be the thing that you would like to inject that we haven't talked about on this panel to date? So I'm not going to force anyone to go first in a particular order, but if anyone wants to volunteer, that would be wonderful. You can also just say, that's a stupid question, Jeff. Here's the one you should have asked, and answer that as well. So who wants to have a crack at any of that? Lachlan, thank you.
So look, I think we've talked a lot about the sort of the technical aspects and the economic aspects. We've talked a lot about the energy system broadly. I'd probably like to broaden that to sort of the broader social challenge of diversity and inclusion. So, I think we should recognise that the energy industry's got pretty poor representation from a diversity perspective. If we're talking about building a future energy system for everybody, it makes a lot of sense to actually have everybody included in that conversation. So the IEA recently released a report really highlighting the challenges of diversity in the energy sector globally. And I think that this is something that's really important for us as a sector to be willing to address. We fundamentally need to support a diverse and inclusive community to ensure we have all the voices involved to give us the future energy system that's going to work for everyone.
Brilliant,
thank you. Who else would like to have a crack?
I'd just like to say that I think we're very good at, we're not very good at solving our problems, but we're very good at highlighting them and making ourselves all feel miserable about everything. But I do think it's important to recognise some of the good things that are happening in this industry. And following up a little bit on Lachlan's point, we are leading the world in distributed energy resources, not by a little bit, but by a country mile. And the way in which that is causing challenges to various distribution companies, I don't think is widely recognised. And the fact that they're keeping the show on the road at all is something that we really should be celebrating. And the same can be true and said of the speed with which large-scale renewables are entering our system. It is, we sort of bash ourselves up about how dreadful we are at emissions, rightly, but we are actually in a group of cohorts that include some of the nations that you look at and think they're doing a terrific job. But we have got large-scale renewables coming in at an unprecedented pace. We've still just keeping the lights on, just. And similarly with DER, it's currently providing about 5% of the energy needs of the nation. It's just solar panels on the roof, largely. And it will be up to 10% very shortly. And with the large-scale stuff coming in, it's going to get to 40% probably by sort of 2030 plus, not that long afterwards. So by the time we get into the mid-30s and we've got, this is without any policy changes particularly, we've got large-scale coal-fired generators retiring because they're just old and they're not making any money, being replaced by renewables. So the thing to watch, I think, is the fact that Tasmania is now running close to 100% renewables. South Australia is running at about 53%, and they don't have the benefit of hydro. And they're struggling with huge amounts of DER. They've got suburbs in Adelaide that are on zero demand, gets to about 11 in the morning, and they are thinking, how are we going to cope with this? The voltage has dropped to nothing, nobody wants any power. So what do you do with your system? It's stuff like that that Australia is working on and catching up with, and we should celebrate those people out there who are keeping it together, which is not to say we shouldn't perhaps be going faster, but we do have some really critical knowledge building up in this country, which I do think we need to recognise, just to be a bit positive for a change.
Well, I love ending on a positive note. So who else would like to end on this?
Yeah, I might just add, I think we've got a bit of a culture of pilot and trialling and not knowing when to stop pilot and trialling. And there's an opportunity that we need to get in terms of backing ourselves and scaling up some solutions. So with our partners, we've recently got the first apartment building up and running, where we've got solar on there, and it's right down to each apartment, and we've been able to tackle that with our partners around apartments. We're also doing a trial with DPIE and City of Parramatta here around renters and trying to fix the split incentive. We're also trying to get a investment community energy project up within the city, and looking at that model around not just providing a financial return, which is quite good for investors, it's typically about 6%, but how do we split that incentive and provide a social return and have a revolving fund that retrofits low-income housing? So it is some of these models that we're pilot and trialling, and we're getting stuck. We need to back a few of these as a sector and scale them up. And and we're also working on the largest microgrid down the Latrobe Valley. So how do we get people into these new models, and how do we scale them up and stop piloting and trialling and go forward?
Wonderful. Alex, did you want to come in with any last comments?
Yep, I'm very happy to come in. I think we are sometimes sort of stuck at the moment. I feel we're talking a lot about, but we're not actually doing it. So I think as a result, we have suboptimal choices really guiding our energy future. And what really keeps me awake at night is how do we actually settle on a more national consensus that is still including the diversity of different opinions, so we can actually start to make decisions. And I think, Alison, what you just said, actually let's actually trial some things, see how it works, and then scale it up if it does work. I think that actually strikes me as a really good approach, and I think we just have to, frankly, get on with it.
Excellent. Cameron, did you want to end with any comments?
No. Probably thrown enough bombs. Yeah. No, I mean, it's very interesting coming as an outsider into this space and hearing what feels like a consensus around climate change, what feels like lots of ideas, a feeling like there are good ideas and things need to happen. I said before, it does look like, you know, a whole new generation is going to come through with a very different set of politics. We're already feeling it at the university. You know, almost the first question in every subject is, what does this have to do with transitions in relation to climate change? So that is coming. The problem with that response is, and I was a bit flippant before, kind of, you know, negative assets who currently exist in employment. So I think there's a really interesting question around retraining for everybody. And I hate to use that word because that's a very bad word to use for the scale of re-education that's kind of needed. So I've always got a question, which is not just what is innovation in the places that you work, but what are the learning practices? I feel like I'm throwing back to the 1990s when we all talked about learning organisations. But what are the learning practices that are actually in place to allow everybody to begin retrofitting so that they are adequate to these kind of challenges? It's a very different kind of educational problem. So those are the thoughts I have in my mind at the moment.
Wonderful. Well, we are at the end of what I've found an incredibly stimulating and interesting debate. I've learned a lot from this, and it's because you've all put your heart and soul into it. So thank you so much for that. Thank you all also for the brilliant questions. You know, it makes for a better discussion when we hear the mood of the room in this. What I'm loving at the bottom of here, what I'm looking at and what you're looking at behind us is the word cloud coming out of that. Climate, leadership, political leadership, community, people, all of that stuff that's going on. But what I'm hearing is celebrate some successes as well. You know, this, despite what you might consider to be a lack of climate leadership, my goodness, look at what's happened. And you're managing with it, and you're learning from it, and that's got to be valuable to someone, right? So now what I think I'm hearing is, let's bravely get some decisions going, let's have some vision, and proceed confidently and be that world leader. So thank you all very much. Thank you all for your questions.